In 1822, Latin America stood on the edge of becoming one single country. Its future depended on just two men in one room. If they agreed, history would look very different. If they didn't, everything would fall apart. They walked in as allies. They walked out as rivals. And from that moment on, the dream of one united Latin America began to die. But to see how it all unraveled, we have to go back to the empire that once held the entire continent together, an empire that ruled for 300 years, and that's where our story begins. That empire was Spain, and it was enormous. For 300 years, they controlled everything from Mexico to Argentina. On a map, it was bigger than all of Europe put together, and they tried running the whole thing from one city, Madrid, which was thousands of miles away across the ocean. Sending a letter from South America to Spain took 3 months by ship. Try running anything with that kind of delay. But the distance wasn't even the worst part. Spain had a rule so unfair, it sounds made up. If you were born in Spain and moved to the Americas, you could get any top job you wanted. But if your parents were Spanish and you happened to be born in the Americas, tough luck. You were called a criollo, and criollos were treated as second class. You could own half the countryside and have more money than a king, but because you were born on the wrong continent, you could never be governor, judge, or general. And every ship from Spain brought another fresh-faced nobody who outranked you. Welcome! My family's been here for 200 years. I own most of the farms around here. Lovely. I am your new governor. Governor? You literally just got off the boat. The king sent me. But I know this place. I know every merchant in the region. Were you born in Spain? No, I was born here. Then you can't be in charge. Sorry, rules. One day, we're gonna do something about this. Good luck with that. In a private house in Bogota, a big city in Colombia, a group of criollos are gathered around a table whispering. One of them pulls out a book about the American Revolution, the one where America broke free from Britain. He jabs his finger at a page. They did it, he whispers. If farmers with muskets can beat the British Empire, what's stopping us? The room goes quiet. Nobody answers. But nobody disagrees either. Spain's empire looked rock solid on the surface, but underneath, millions of furious criollos were doing all the actual work while newcomers from Spain took every important job. The anger kept building, decade after decade. And then, a very short French emperor accidentally set the whole thing on fire. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor who already controlled most of Europe, decided he wanted Spain too, and his plan to get it was so sneaky it sounds like a cartoon villain scheme. He invited the Spanish king to a friendly meeting in France. The king thought they'd have a nice chat. Instead, Napoleon threw him in prison and put his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Just like that, Spain now belonged to Napoleon's family. When the news finally reached the Americas, the criollos had a very interesting question on their hands. If their king was rotting in a French cell, who exactly were they taking orders from? Wait, our king has been kidnapped by Napoleon. Yep, locked up in France. And Napoleon's brother is now king of Spain. Apparently so. I'm not taking orders from Napoleon's brother. I don't even take orders from my own brother. So, what do we do now? What do we do now? Simple. We run things ourselves. In the name of the real king, of course. So, technically, we're not rebels. Exactly. Just loyal subjects who happen to be completely in charge now. And if the king never comes back? Then, oops. It was a genius move. By claiming loyalty to the imprisoned king, they could kick out Spanish officials and set up their own local councils, called juntas, to run things. But what's crazy is every criollo on the continent came up with the exact same idea at almost the exact same time. In a warehouse in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, a local merchant heard the news and went straight to his back room. He pulled a dusty tarp off a pile of muskets he'd been collecting for years and started handing them to his neighbors. For the king, he told each one with a wink. Nobody asked which king he meant. Within months, juntas popped up across the continent. Buenos Aires, Bogotá, Caracas, Santiago. At first, they said they were just looking after things until the real king came home. But once they got a taste of running their own affairs, going back to taking orders from Spain started to feel less and less appealing. The revolution had begun across an entire continent, but these brand new governments weren't about to join forces. Oh no, they had a much worse idea. They were about to start fighting each other. Buenos Aires, the biggest and richest city in the south, immediately declared itself the leader of the whole region. They wanted every nearby territory to join their new government. Paraguay, the smaller territory right next door, took one look at that and said, absolutely not. Buenos Aires didn't handle rejection well. In 1811, they sent an entire army marching into Paraguay to force them to join up. Imagine that. They hadn't even finished fighting Spain yet, and they were already invading their neighbors. Paraguay's army defeated them in battle and sent them running back home. Hold on, Buenos Aires attacked Paraguay? Yep, sent a whole army. But, aren't we supposed to be on the same side? Apparently not. So, we're fighting Spain and each other now? Welcome to South American independence. This is the worst group project I've ever seen. And the teacher hasn't even come back yet. Up north, things went even worse. Venezuela proudly declared independence in 1811, but in March 1812, a massive earthquake ripped through Caracas and killed thousands of people. In a wrecked church outside the city, a priest who still supported Spain climbed onto a pile of broken stones and pointed at the sky. "God is angry!" he shouted at a crowd of terrified survivors. "You turned against your king, and this is what happens!" Enough people were already scared and desperate. They believed the priest, abandoned the revolution, and went back to supporting Spain. Soldiers deserted, whole towns switched sides, and Venezuela's revolution collapsed almost overnight. Then in 1814, Napoleon was finally defeated back in Europe, and the Spanish king was set free from his French prison. He came home, grabbed his crown, and sent warships to crush every single rebellion in the Americas. By 1815, Spain had retaken Venezuela, Colombia, and Chile. Buenos Aires and Paraguay were the only ones still free from Spanish control, and Paraguay refused to cooperate with anyone, including Buenos Aires. The whole revolution looked dead and buried. But on opposite ends of the continent, two guys were quietly cooking up the most ridiculous military plan anyone had ever heard. Those two guys couldn't have been more different. From the south came José de San Martín, a quiet Argentine general who had actually spent years fighting in Spain's own army before switching sides. From the north came Simón Bolívar, a wealthy Venezuelan who talked big, dressed flashy, and had already tried to lead two revolutions in Venezuela. Both times, he'd been beaten back by Spanish forces and chased into exile. They didn't know each other. They were thousands of miles apart, but somehow they came up with the exact same crazy idea: drag an entire army over the Andes Mountains. Those are the massive wall of mountains running down the entire west side of South America. Taller than any mountains in Europe, freezing at the top, and deadly to cross even on a good day. But the Spanish armies were camped on the other side, and they'd never expect anyone to come over the top. The Spanish controlled Chile. How exactly do we get there? Over the Andes. The mountains taller than the clouds? With cannons and thousands of mules to carry our supplies. Sir, people die just walking across the Andes. Which is exactly why the Spanish won't expect an army to do it. Because it's impossible? Because it's unexpected. Big difference. Is there though? Somewhere high in the Andes, one of San Martin's mules carrying two cannons decided it had seen enough. It sat down and refused to move. 3 soldiers pushed from behind, 2 pulled from the front, and 1 tried reasoning with it. The mule just stared at them. Eventually, they unloaded 1 cannon and carried it themselves. The mule casually stood up and kept walking. In January 1817, San Martin crossed the Andes with around 5,000 soldiers, hauling cannons through frozen passes above 10,000 feet. When they came crashing down into Chile, the Spanish were completely stunned. San Martin defeated them in battle and freed the whole country. Bolívar pulled off a similar trick from the north, marching his army through flooded jungle plains where soldiers waded chest-deep in water for days, then up frozen mountain passes into Colombia. He surprised the Spanish there too, and won a massive victory. After that, he convinced the leaders of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador that they'd be stronger together than apart, and merged them into one massive nation called Gran Colombia. Two men had freed half a continent, but they had very different ideas about what they wanted to do with it. And when they finally met, things would go very, very badly. Bolivar wasn't satisfied with just beating Spain. He wanted to stitch the entire continent into one gigantic super country. And for about 5 minutes, it actually looked like it might work. Gran Colombia was his masterpiece. All 3 countries united under one flag run from the capital in Bogota. 3 nations combined into the biggest force in South America. Tiny problem. The capital sat right in the middle of Colombia, and the other 2 regions were not happy about that. Great news! We're all one big nation now! Gran Colombia! Sounds lovely! Who's in charge? Bolivar! Capital's in Bogota! That's in your part of the country. It's the capital of all of us! So you make decisions, and we just go along with it? We make decisions for the nation! The nation whose capital happens to be in your backyard! Do you want one strong country or 20 weak ones? Ask me again in 10 years. Spoiler alert, she didn't need anywhere near 10 years. Meanwhile, things were falling apart even in places that had nothing to do with Bolivar. Over in Mexico, who had fought its own separate war against Spain, a Mexican general named Agustin de Iturbide decided that being a regular leader wasn't impressive enough, so he declared himself emperor. The smaller countries of Central America briefly joined his empire, hoping a bigger nation would keep them safe. But once they saw Iturbide acting like a king, they changed their minds and broke away to form their own united republic. Everywhere you looked, the same thing was happening. Countries were breaking free from Spain and then immediately cracking apart from the inside. Freedom was spreading like wildfire, but nobody could agree on who should be running things. And the one man who thought he had the answer was about to sit down with the only other man on the continent who could challenge him. That meeting would go very, very badly. In July 1822, the 2 greatest heroes of the revolution finally met face to face in Guayaquil, a port city on the coast of Ecuador. But Bolivar had pulled a fast one. He'd arrived weeks earlier and quietly filled the city with his own soldiers and flags. That meant when they sat down to talk, everyone already knew who was really in charge of that room. By the time San Martin's ship pulled into the harbor, the place already looked like Bolivar's personal kingdom. The quiet general from the south stepped off the boat and realized he'd walked straight into a setup. They shook hands, said their hellos, and then disappeared into a room. Just the 2 of them. No advisors or anybody taking notes. Nobody writing anything down at all. To this day, nobody knows exactly what was said. But we can piece together the basics. This continent needs to be united. Agreed. Under a republic. Under me. I was thinking a king, a European prince, someone with no connection to any side here, a neutral figure everyone could accept. A European prince? We spent 15 years kicking Europeans out! Fine, then give me your troops and we finish Peru together. Or give me your troops and I finish it myself. I'll serve under you, just let me help. That's generous, but I work best alone. San Martin walked out of that room a broken man. He had freed Argentina, liberated Chile, and half of Peru. And now the only person who could help him finish the job had basically told him to leave. That evening in Guayaquil, a harbor worker watched a tired-looking man board a small ship in the dark. No flags, no cheering, no crowd. Just one man with a bag climbing aboard quietly. The worker had no idea he was watching one of the greatest generals in history leave South America forever. San Martin gave up. He handed his armies over to Bolivar and sailed away to France, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life. Bolivar marched south, crushed Spain's last armies, freed Peru, and by 1825 had created a brand new country, Bolivia, named after himself. He even wrote Bolivia's first constitution, the rules for how the country would be run. Spain's 300-year grip on the Americas was finally over. But winning the war turned out to be the easy part. 2 years. That's how long the peace lasted before Bolivar's super country started ripping itself apart. Venezuela wanted out, Ecuador wanted out, and Bolivar made the worst possible move. He declared himself dictator, which meant he could make any decision he wanted without asking anyone. Nobody had fought a revolution against a distant king just to hand all their power to a distant president who acted like one. Mr. President, Venezuela has declared independence. From Spain? From us, from Gran Colombia. I literally crossed mountains for them. They're grateful, they just don't want Bogota bossing them around. Ecuador? Also leaving. Bolivia? Throughout the constitution you wrote for them. Is anyone still in? Colombia is mostly here? For now. And it wasn't just the South falling apart. Up in Central America, the United Republic that had formed after breaking away from Mexico was cracking too. The problem was the same one everyone else had. The capital was in Guatemala, and the other 4 regions were sick of Guatemala making all the decisions. Nicaragua left, then Costa Rica, then Honduras, then Guatemala stood alone. In a tiny schoolhouse in Guatemala City, a teacher unrolled a brand new map for her students. She pointed to the big country labeled Federal Republic of Central America and started her lesson. A kid in the back raised his hand. Ma'am, my dad says that country doesn't exist anymore. She looked at the map. He was right. It had split into 5 separate nations just that month. She rolled it back up and sighed. I need a new one. Again. By 1830, Bolivar was seriously ill with a deadly lung disease, exhausted and completely heartbroken. The man who had freed 6 countries watched his greatest creation crumble. He reportedly said, "He who serves a revolution plows the sea," meaning all that sacrifice, all those frozen mountain passes, for nothing. He died in December 1830, almost completely broke. By 1831, Gran Colombia had shattered into 3 separate countries, and Central America had become 5. But there was one place on the entire continent that somehow held together, and the reason why is completely wild. Remember how Napoleon invaded Spain and everything went haywire? Well, next door in Portugal, he pulled the exact same move. But the Portuguese royal family did something the Spanish royals never thought of. They ran away, packed up the whole court, jumped on ships, and sailed to Brazil. And here's where it gets interesting. When the Portuguese king, João VI, arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, he didn't just hide out and wait for things to blow over. He made Brazil the new center of the whole Portuguese empire. He opened the ports to international trade, set up schools and courts, and moved the whole royal operation to Rio. His son, a young prince called Dom Pedro, grew up running around the streets of Rio like a local kid. He learned to speak like a Brazilian, he made Brazilian friends, he ate Brazilian food, and by the time he was an adult, he didn't feel Portuguese at all. He felt Brazilian. Then Portugal made an enormous mistake. In 1821, the Portuguese parliament demanded Brazil go back to being a regular colony. And Dom Pedro? They wanted him shipped back to Lisbon immediately. Parliament says you must return to Portugal now. No! You can't say no to Parliament. I just did. Brazil must go back to being a colony. Brazil has universities now, and a navy. You want us to go backwards? Those are your orders. Tell Parliament that Brazil is its own country now. Independence or death. He's serious, isn't he? On September 7th, 1822, Dom Pedro made it official and declared Brazil independent. And unlike every Spanish colony around it, Brazil stayed whole. One huge country held together by a prince the people actually liked. The Spanish colonies had nobody, just an empty throne and a continent full of generals who all wanted to sit in it. Here's something that'll mess with your head. Today, roughly 400 million people across Latin America speak the same language, follow the same religion, and share 300 years of history. They have more in common than the 13 American colonies that became the United States. So why has nobody ever managed to put them back together? Because something much scarier than Spain showed up to fill the gap. When the dust settled, not a single one of the countries had ever governed itself. Since the day Spain arrived, every decision had been made by someone in Madrid. Suddenly, they needed governments, courts, and tax systems, and nobody had a clue how to build any of it. So, military strongmen called caudillos stepped in. Tough guys with soldiers who basically said, "I'm in charge now," and nobody could stop them. In Argentina, a cattle rancher named Juan Manuel de Rosas took over and ruled like a king for 20 years. Every country got its own version of the same thing, and none of these strongmen were about to share power with anyone. Sir, what if we, joined forces with our neighbors? Shared an army, shared a government?
Share my army?
For the good of the continent!
I didn't fight a revolution to share anything!
Bolivar wanted us united!
Bolivar is dead. I am alive, and I have cannons.
Fair point, sir.
Any other bright ideas?
Nope. That was the only one. That's all. And then there was the land itself. See those massive Andes Mountains running down the west side? And that enormous green area in the middle? That's the Amazon rainforest. Basically an ocean of jungle the size of Western Europe. Between the mountains, the jungle, and thousands of miles of desert, sending a letter between two capital cities could take weeks. In a world before phones or the internet, that made working together almost impossible. On top of all that, foreign powers like Britain actually wanted Latin America to stay divided. Smaller countries were easier to push around and easier to sell things to. Britain signed trade deals with each little nation separately, making sure that each depended on London instead of on each other. They even encouraged rivalries between neighbors to keep anyone from teaming up. By the time railways and telegraphs finally started connecting the continent decades later, the window had closed. The borders had hardened. People didn't think of themselves as Latin Americans anymore. They were Argentines, Colombians, Chileans, and those caudillos, they had zero intention of giving up their little kingdoms for anyone. If you made it this far, you probably love history as much as we do. So hit like, hit sub for more deep dives like this, and check out the next video on your screen right now. I'll catch you next time.